Hi, it's Jake coming at you with another Morphe game. I'm going to do a quick spiel again about memorizing games. I really think it's a good way to drill patterns into your brain such that it's not just you have this knowledge, but that it coalesces as this skill and becomes something that makes you a better player, makes you better able to verbalize and understand moves, see ideas, and think, aha, I have seen a similar pattern before. I know that pattern. I've memorized this game with that idea or with some comparable idea. You can look for analogs when you know positions. You can see new positions and think, what does it have in common? What doesn't it? What was an idea in that position? Does it apply here? Why or why not? And so memorizing games isn't the only way to achieve that, but it also makes, when we see a game, it's really easy to look at a game being played and just follow along, maybe do a little thinking, but mostly it's just passive. And if you have to memorize it, for most people, including myself, you're going to have to understand it for it to stick. And for you to understand it, you're going to have to actively engage with the game. And there may be other methods to actively engage, but just watching videos, I think, often very passive learning, and that's okay, but I really like active learning, and so I really like this memorization project, and it's a big part of how I became a master. So anyways, this is Morphe versus Meek. Meek was not a particularly strong player, but a reasonable player in the Americas. He ended up actually working as an attorney general for the Polk administration, and I'm not going to get too political on this one, mostly because I know very little about the Polk administration, except that he came in, he said, I have these 3 or 4 goals, and I'm going to do them in one term, and then I'm going to get out. And he did those 3 or 4 goals, and then he got out, which means some historians rate him as a tremendously effective president. Now, as far as I know, his 3 or 4 goals were quite horribly evil. The war with Mexico was just pretty destructive for no real point, as far as I know. And his other stuff, I think, was similarly kind of disastrous. But for a certain type of person, I think often libertarian-leaning, he has great appeal as a president. And this guy was attorney general for him and is about to get crushed. So our opening is a Scotch gambit. I don't remember if he played d4 or bishop c4 first. If entering the Scotch gambit myself, I would play a d4 move order, not a bishop c4 move order, because against bishop c4 they can play bishop c5 and suddenly d4 isn't really playable. Against knight f6 we can transpose to the Scotch gambit. But with d4, black's only real move is ed4, and white can get a Scotch gambit every time. So I would definitely approach the Scotch gambit with a d4 move order. And I am going to talk a little about the opening specifically because I have shown some players how to play it, trained some players to play it with the white pieces. And so here, my recommendation to people is not the move played in the game, knight g5, but is instead c3. And one thing I like about c3 is it has this trick. Pawn takes, bishop takes f7, king takes f7, queen d5, forking the king and the bishop. And when the king retreats, usually d6 is played. cb2, bishop takes, this pawn's going to be hit, it just helps white's development. So black usually plays d6. And you get this position where we have equal material, but black's king can't castle, and so white has a nice advantage, and black has to deal with the threat on g7. Better for black here is knight f6, hitting the pawn. White advances, and black counterattacks with d5, and you get, I think, a pretty balanced game. Not to spend too long, but I think this position's pretty close to equal. I think white's probably a touch better. The computer will tell you white's a touch better with natural development. But I think black's actually a little easier to play with bishop g4 and f6 to undermine white's center. White has trickier problems to solve, I think, than black, but is slightly better for it. Anyway, knight g5 is not so accurate. And it's not so accurate because Morphe plays the correct move. So the threat is knight takes f7 or bishop takes f7. And the question is how to defend it. And there are 2 fairly obvious ways in knight h6 and knight e5. And I think you should pause and think, which would you play and why? So both moves have some appeal. Knight h6 develops a piece we have not brought into the game. We've already developed the knight on c6 and defends f7. Knight e5 moves the same piece twice in the opening, but counterattacks c4 while defending f7. I think knight e5 would be better, the move's knight h6, but I think knight e5 would be better if white didn't have a tactical opportunity here. And we saw in this sideline this bishop f7 followed by queen d5 trick. And white often has tactics like that, and in fact has one here, with knight takes f7, knight takes, bishop takes, king takes, queen h5 check, forking king and bishop, and white is better. But you might ask, doesn't knight h6 fall for the same tactic? Well, this is the advantage of having not moved a piece twice in the opening. When we fell for it with knight e5, we ended up with a position where our other knight was still on g8, right? Now, when they do the same thing, and Meek went for the tactic, he was, tactically sharp, at the end of the line, we have our knight on c6, while at the end of the other version, the knight would be inactive on g8. So Morphy finds a way that we basically have an extra tempo here, our knight is more actively placed, and continues playing actively with d6. If queen c4, has bishop e6, and can just keep activating his pieces. The king's not not in much danger here. White has no pieces besides the queen that could really attack it. The king has squares to tuck away, pieces ready to come defend it if needed. The king's not actually in much danger here. Which reminds me, and this isn't important, and if you're trying to memorize this game, certainly don't need to memorize this, but it makes me think about lines with the fork trick, where Emanuel Lasker found, well over a century ago now, knight takes e4 here with the idea of d5, winning back the piece, and black equalizes. So white players in response thought, aha, when I take your knight, you're going to play d5. So I'm going to give up the bishop first to expose your king, and only then will I take. And the problem is this is actually worse for white, because when black takes over the center, black has so much control of useful squares that white never really has any attack. Knight g5 doesn't really help. e4 is now threatened, and then the knight won't have a defender. h6 can come if it needs to be driven away. Black has easy defense, and white has no attack, because black's control of the center is so great that in fact it's much better for black to play knight takes e4, d5, bishop d3, when black will have to trade one of their center pawns off. And so, despite the fact that it looks like bishop takes f7 might expose the black king, black's taking over of the center is worth much more, and in fact means the king's quite safe. And I feel kind of similar things about this position. Black has two pretty good central pawns, has a knight, is ahead in development, is going to be more ahead in development soon, for instance queen c4, bishop e6, and black will have both their minor pieces developed while white will have none, and the king's not actually in that much danger. So white played queen b5. What I like about Morphy games is his opponents make moves that you can understand, you can see what they were trying to do. Meek saw, queen c4, bishop e6, I'm just helping you develop. I don't want you to bring out your bishop. Queen b5, keep an eye on b7, and you can't bring out the bishop. And Morphy instantly activates more of his pieces, plays rook e8, threatening to take on e4. And maybe Meek should just castle away, give up the pawn, but continue playing. Note, there isn't a trap, rook takes e4, queen d5 check, forks king and rook, but because the rook can block, it doesn't pick up the rook. So Meek played f3, and Morphy wants to add pressure. Morphy sees the king in the center, he's just going to play as actively as possible. He plays d5, threatening de4. And again, maybe white should run. Here running makes some sense, because this is going to be a discovered check. The king will be safe, but that will give white some time to organize their pieces. But Meek instead decides, aha, I can pin the pawn. I don't want to give up the pawn. I'm just going to try to keep it. I'm going to do so by pinning the pawn. Now note, Meek hasn't really developed any pieces in a while, and this is another queen move. And Morphy goes, okay, you're pinning the pawn, and I want to attack you in the center. How can I get rid of your pinning piece? Knight a5. Hit the queen. It can't stay on this diagonal. c4 is covered. Therefore, when it is driven away, I will be able to take on e4. I think Meek's best move is queen a3, hitting the knight, making black have to keep an eye on that knight, but he decided to defend the pawn with queen d3. And Morphy sees an opportunity to open up the black king. And I think this is a little reminiscent of that kind of trap many people learn, where f6 is played, and white can in fact sacrifice the knight, so the queen comes in. And either the king has to be exposed, or black plays g6, and is forked on h8 and e8. But there's this missing f-pawn, and queen h5 becomes very strong. And anytime there's this missing f-pawn, queen h5 is very tempting, and Morphy goes for queen h4, the equivalent move, immediately. And we see a similar problem. Either the king has to move, or if g3 is played, we're going to win the e4 pawn. So g3 was played. Moving the king was too horrendous a possibility for Meek to consider. And here, I think this is quite an interesting position. Black has two ways to take, and Morphy actually chose the wrong one. So look a little, think what you'd take and why, or which way you'd take. Okay, Morphy took with the rook. Now this looks very tempting. We keep our queen on the board. Generally, we want queens on the board if their king's more vulnerable, and you best believe their king is more vulnerable at the moment. So rook takes makes a lot of sense. The thing is, after queen takes, we win a pawn, and the attack continues. Bishop g4, we're threatening rook e2, they have no development, maybe the other rook can come over to f8 or e8. Black's just winning here. I mean, it's just a crushing attack up a pawn, and white has no development. All their pieces are on their starting squares, while Morphy's are all going to be very active. So, queen takes was best. Rook takes allows white a really interesting defensive resource. And I think when looking at these games, these great games, one thing to do is not just take all the mistakes the losing player made as gospel, but to think like, where did they have resources? What could they have done? If you are in a similar tough position, what could you spot? And white does have a defensive resource because black's queen is hanging. If white does something they might normally not be able to get away with, black might not be able to punish due to at some point their queen being taken. And white has this really strong move, bishop e3. And the point is, the queen's hit. If the queen retreats, white can castle with check and then escape with the bishop. Now black's still up a pawn there, but the game continues. If black takes, check, great, I'm going to win your queen. You know, looks great. But queen takes, pawn takes queen, and white actually is an exchange for the pawn they've lost, and white might actually be better here. So after bishop e3, queen e7 would have been best, but bishop e3, really nice defensive resource, noting that you can take my bishop, but your queen is hit. However, Meek did not find bishop e3, instead went king f2. And now Morphy actually made another mistake. The rest of the game will be perfect and really nicely played. I really like this game. But Morphy made two mistakes, and both gave white interesting defensive opportunities. So think a bit about what you'd play here. Okay, so queen e7 was played. Queen f6 is very similar to the queen takes e4 line, in that after queen f3, bishop g4, queen takes, king takes, the rook's crashing through on e2. We've seen this position before. It's completely winning for black, though the king was on f7 last time. Queen e7 allows white a defensive resource. Now, generally the worst defenders of a kind of pressured piece are the king and queen. Why? Because they are of such high value that if they're attacked, they're easy to drive away. Well, if a pawn's defending it and the pawn's attacked, you don't have to worry so much. You know, it's just a pawn. So white has this nice shot, bishop g5. And if the queen takes, the e4 rook hangs. And if the queen doesn't take, it tries to stay on another square, then white has time for knight d2, driving the rook away. And again, Meek did not see the defensive shot. It's tricky to see. You know, you have to be tactically aware. I think this one's a bunch easier to see than last turn's bishop e3, but Morphy should not have allowed this. On the other hand, if Morphy had played queen f6, he would have won a game that would have not gone down in the history books. So sometimes it's nice that Morphy's accuracy was not as high as it could be. The opponent did not see bishop g5 and played knight d2. But with the bishop stuck in, rather than out here, there's no control of e3, so Morphy's rook has a nice square. And now Morphy really wants to play rook e2. And the question is, how can Meek stop? Save the queen and stop rook e2. Well, there are two squares, here and here. a6 is covered by the pawn, c4 is covered by the knight, e2 is of course covered by the rook. No other squares defend e2, so white went queen b5. Hit the knight, defend d2. Surely this solves all Meek's problems. Of course it didn't, and Morphy just plays the active c6. Now if queen takes the knight, Morphy calculated out to mate, and you should too. Alright, so Meek played queen f1, the only square to keep e2 defended. But if queen takes a5, rook e2 check. The king has three squares it can go to. Let's refute them all. King f1, bishop h3 check, king g1, queen e3, checkmate. We have three pieces around their king, their rook is terrible, all their pieces are terrible. The great thing about so many of Morphy's games is he's so good at bringing all his pieces into the game, and just his opponents never get any in the game. And you can just see in his games how big an advantage it is to have active pieces. Because like when great players play today, no GM is going to allow all their pieces to be stuck like this. You're not going to see kind of games of this kind of educational value. While if I play or you play, there's a pretty decent chance that if we play well, opponents will, not manage to get their pieces out. And ideally, you can learn from Morphy's games and play very actively against it. King G1, Queen E3 check. The king is only one square. This is another checkmate. And King F3. We should not go Queen E4. The knight defends it, but Queen E3 is checkmate because the bishop defends the G4 square. Therefore, White played Queen F1. I don't know how long Morphy thought here, but Morphy, the critical idea, Morphy wants Rook E2. How to achieve Rook E2? Well, he's already offered to sacrifice a knight. Now he sacrifices a bishop to try to deflect the queen. Meek played here, finding the only square that keeps E2 under control. But let's look at takes. Rook E2 check. And now, King G1 is still mated easily. But I should have paused. You should think, solve Rook E2 mating in all lines. But okay. King F1. Now this is a little trickier because we don't have Bishop H3 now, but Rook E1 does the bill. Checkmate. And lastly, King F3. Now Queen E3 last time was checkmate because the bishop controlled. Now it isn't checkmate. Luckily, we have this pawn push. White can give up the queen, but then they're going to get mated and be down a queen. So King H4, and now find checkmate. It's in one move. Incidentally, H4 was the only square they could go to. Everywhere else is covered. So King H4 and Queen E7 is a kind of neat checkmate. This retreat onto the diagonal. So Meek played Queen D1, trying to keep E2. And now, this is probably my favorite move of the game, because Morphy's used all his pieces, he's offered to sacrifice the knight and bishop, yet he hasn't crashed through on E2. And the last Morphy game we saw, the Opera House game, there was this real, I think John Bartholomew, I think I stole this from him, described it as an efficiency. All his pieces get used, and when he finally delivers checkmate, he only has 2 pieces left, and that's all he needs, but every piece has taken part in the attack. And Morphy had this really wonderful instinct for just involving all his pieces, and just plays Rook F8, bringing the last piece that hadn't helped into the game. And the threat's just to move the king. White played Knight F3, trying to block, and Morphy just played King E8, and White resigned, which is a wonderful finish, to play King E8, forcing the opponent to give up. Knight F3, the idea was both to block the F-file and to open up an attack on E3, but it doesn't do anything because bishop takes E3, queen takes E3 is mate, and if the bishop doesn't take on E3, Rook F3 is coming, and White just loses on the spot. So I really like this Morphy game. I think the opening's interesting. I like the Scotch gambit. This early Knight G5 is interesting because Black has the 2 ways to handle it, and it's important to note that the one that brings out a piece that hasn't been developed before is best. Also, this is an interesting tactic. Knight takes F7 to lead to a Queen H5 fork. It's a neat tactic, but doesn't do much here. The king's not so bad, and Black has easy development. Then I like Black's E-file play, quickly putting pressure on the E4 pawn, drives away the thing stopping captures. Then as soon as you can take on E4 and play Queen H4 check, that's appealing. Now here, it's interesting that Queen takes is better than Rook takes, and that endgame with Bishop takes and Rook takes after trading queens is so strong for Black. Here, there's this really interesting and important defensive resource of Bishop E3. Anytime you're being attacked and the opponent is like checking you but leaving a lot of squares, a lot of pieces hanging, you're going to have potential for defensive opportunities like Bishop E3. And it would have been a really cool move if Meek had found it. Of course, then I'd probably never have seen the game because it wouldn't be a famous one. Then Queen F6 again leads to that favorable endgame where all the pieces come forward. Meant to go to G4 there. But Queen E7 leads to this position again. White had this nice defensive shot with Bishop G5 where Black really wants to make it through on E2, and White tries to prevent them. And at each stage, Black tries to invade, and when White fully defends E2, Black brings their final piece into the attack and plays King E8, leading to resignation. So I hope you enjoyed that Morphy game. I think it's quite a nice one. I think the two places he made mistakes really show us some interesting defensive resource ideas. The bishop g5 deflection and the very surprising bishop e3 just blocking the check when it's hanging two different ways. So I hope you enjoyed this Morphy game. I think it's a fun one. Of course, it's not as good as the Opera House game, but it's a nice Morphy game. It's a quick one. Yeah, I hope you liked it.